Hello everyone and welcome to Season 2 of the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan. Now for this season, we will be bringing guests who will share their own path to happiness. Now we all have a different definition to what happiness means to us, individually speaking. For some, it's a huge mansion by the ocean, while others will prefer excellent health and longevity. Now in this season, my guests will share their journeys on overcoming challenges and managing to keep moving forward despite the odds. Now this show will make you laugh or cry, but most importantly, it will inspire you. If they went through tough times and survived, you can too. Now no matter how hard things may seem, there's always something good coming around the corner. Something painful things can teach us lessons that we didn't think we needed to learn. Now today, we have a returning guest, Jordan Cooper, who will share his very interesting career in politics, his many challenges he had to face, the one he was successfully able to overcome, and the others, well, not so much. Now, Jordan is the host of Public Interest Podcast and is the president of Revealing Our Humanity Communication. He currently serves on the Western Montgomery County Citizen Advisory Board, the White Flint Downtown Advisory Committee, and the Rockville Selective Service Board. He is in the area coordinator in District 16 for the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee and is a member of the District 16 Democratic Board. Jordan has a master's degree in health policy from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. In this sequel episode, Jordan will discuss more about his public interest podcast, which we were unable to thoroughly cover in the past episode. Jordan, thank you so much for being here again in our studio.
Dan,
welcome to the Happiness Journey.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Good. So tell me more about Public Interest Podcast and why did you start it and what is your mission?
Sure. So Public Interest Podcast is a show. Podcast, let's just define that, is an online radio show. And on Public Interest Podcast, I interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. I've interviewed governors, Nobel Prize winners, congressmen, senators, rabbis, imams, national news broadcasters, Pulitzer Prize winners,
Wow.
Everyone. You know, from the highest echelons of government throughout, and in fact, I've even done a global audience. I've interviewed foreign ambassadors to the United States, and I've also taken some time in Europe to interview European politicians. And why am I doing all this? You asked about my mission. Well, it's somewhat, you also alluded to my previous political campaign. It's derived from that campaign to some extent. Now, essentially, when I was running for office, I would go around and people would say, well, you look like a nice guy, Jordan. You know, I don't know if I still look like, but, you know, they told me at the time I looked like a nice guy, and they said, well, you know, why would a nice guy like you want to become a politician? They're such terrible people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course, I've been in politics for 14 years in Maryland, and I know many politicians. None of them are too terrible. In fact, I think some of them are most noble and honorable people in our society. So I said to myself, well, why do they have that idea? And I thought, well, every time you read about a politician or you see them on the news, usually they're screwing up in some way. There's some malfeasance, there's some corruption. And the idea is, well, if every time I ever hear about a politician and I'm a member of the public and I hear that it's a terrible thing, maybe all politicians are up to no good. But in fact, I've found that most, at least it's my hypothesis, that most politicians are really doing the nuts and bolts of government. They're taking care of casework. They're balancing budgets. They're doing their real job, and it's a little bit too boring and not sensationalist enough for our current competitive news environment. So I thought, what if I could create a platform where we could tell the stories. Now, half of my interviews are political and half aren't. So I said, what if we can create a platform where we can tell the stories of these politicians? We can inspire people and show them that it's only good news and that these are people who really are doing the best they can to make society better. On the other hand, I wanted to say, well, you know, if little Sally is listening to the show and she's saying, well, you know, I don't ever feel like I want to grow up and be governor. I'd like to be a physician. Well, you know what? We have hospital CEOs and physicians and bureaucrats and all sorts of individuals on the show who are in their own way seeking to make the world better. So I want to inspire others to public service. And back on the political note, when I was running for office, I was seeking to represent a 120,000 person constituency. Now, even though I worked as hard as I possibly could on that campaign, I met about 40,000 people. Now, that's a third of the total number of the district, but to be honest, I'm not even sure I met that many of the constituents in the district. So what I do is I would get to meet these voters sometimes through something called meet and greets, where someone like you would invite someone like me over to your living room for a 20-minute period of time, an hour period of time, and I'd talk to you and you get a chance to know me, and that might make you more interested in the campaign. So I said, how do we scale that electronically? So I'd hope that people would increase voter turnout, become more invested in their own community and the political system through the podcast. Finally, I thought, I want to have a diverse array of individuals. Obviously, as a politician, I ran as a Democrat. I'm a progressive liberal Democrat. But I wanted to make sure that liberal Democrats, it seems like we need more dialogue in this country. And so I wanted liberal Democrats to hear from conservative, libertarian Trump supporters in the middle of America and say, how are they trying to advance the public interest? How do they constitute the public interest? I think everybody's seeking to advance it. We just disagree on how exactly we can get there. And then I thought, well, I hear there's anti-Semitism in Charlottesville, and there's xenophobia and a rising tide of anti-establishment populism. What if we expose people to these differences, these different identities that they're not as often exposed to, and through that exposure we can enhance familiarity and tolerance and acceptance, hopefully, ultimately. So those are some of my primary goals, that and also supplementing the decline of the Fourth Estate. We're here in Montgomery County, Maryland. As we know, the Gazette shut down a few years ago due to the Washington Post closing it down. There's not as much local media, especially on political affairs, as there used to be. And so I'm trying to kind of help fill that void. So those are some of the mission statements of Public Interest Podcasts.
Interesting. Now, do you think that this will help you for your campaign in 2018?
Undoubtedly, I think it will. There's worse things to be associated with than the public interest. So if somebody thinks Jordan Cooper and then they think public interest, I'm okay with that association. Also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of victory in political campaigns is associated strongly with name recognition. So the more you get your name out there, the more you enhance your brand, the more I'm associated with various individuals who seek to use their lives to advance the public interest, I think the better. But that's not necessarily the main thrust of the podcast. I just think that's a positive externality associated with the podcast.
Now, would you go and interview your political competitors for 2018? Would you go that route?
Certainly. I already have interviewed two of the incumbents who are running for re-election and who will be on the ballot with me. So you could make the case that I'm competing against them. I've interviewed Delegate Mark Corman, who beat me last time. And I certainly am open to interviewing a variety of individuals. Again, it's not so much about advancing my personal interests. It's about advancing the public interest. And in my campaign, I'm not about advancing the Democratic Party or Jordan Cooper. I'm seeking to advance the public interest. And for me, the vehicle to do that is through the Democratic Party here in Bethesda, Maryland, and also through my own candidacy in elected office. But of course, there are many ways to advance some of my policy platforms. For instance, my opposition to gerrymandering is supported by Maryland's Common Cause. I could contribute money to them. I can volunteer with them. So it's not that you necessarily need to run, but I'm choosing that right now I'm running as a Democrat and using my candidacy to advance the public interest as best as I see fit.
Interesting. Now, what is your vision? Where do you want to take Public Interest Podcast? I mean, is it going to continue being the same concept, or are you going to tweak it a little bit? How do you see it?
So I'm always iterating with Public Interest Podcasts. I have the website. I'm on 13 platforms, iTunes. It's on publicinterestpodcast.com. I also have something called Your Voice, where I go to live events and I interview people as a journalist with 60-second episodes, just live street interviews with Facebook live streaming. And I speak to them about their opinions on particular policy issues. For instance, I went to downtown D.C. and asked people what they thought about D.C. statehood. Or I asked marchers last April about President Trump and whether he should release his tax returns and things of that nature. So I'm always iterating. I'm also planning something called Public Interest Day for January 13th, 2018. And that's where I'd have a few governors, a few panel discussions, award ceremonies, movie screenings, all discussing how you advance the public interest for Montgomery County and Maryland. So yeah, I'm always trying to iterate. Where do I see it going? It's not really clear. I've done 250 episodes. I just did a U.S. Cabinet Secretary, a senator, some governors. Always new experiences, and I welcome those new experiences, and we'll see how it evolves. Obviously, I'd like to increase the following, and the greater the following, the greater an opportunity for long-term sustainability. So we'll see where it goes, and I'm happy to enjoy the journey.
Wow. And how do you have time to do all those episodes?
So that is a good point. It's difficult to do all this non-remunerated activity with the podcast and the various different boards and running for office. They're not always bringing revenue to my house, and I have to balance a career. But I think ultimately they're 24 hours a day, and I'm blessed with the opportunity to do good time management, and I'd consider myself to be rather efficient. So somehow you make it all work.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, so the amount of hours of sleep is what, two a day at least?
I try to do a little better than that, but it is a busy schedule.
Beautiful. Well, we will take a quick break. Now stay tuned to hear more from our guest, Jordan Cooper. Message from the universe. When negative thought attract unpleasant outcome. Shh, not that you ever would, but when someone tells their best friend about their difficult day, or how tricky relationship have been, or that they have a jolly good life in most regard except financially, not only do they relive the unpleasantness, but they commission all the elements to project their future, whatever they've been claiming. Besides, you never say jolly. Better to whisper sweet nothing. Many tend to share everything about their lives on social media, the good, the bad, and the worst. For all your successes, you tend to share it on Facebook to get positive feedback and congratulations. What you're not aware of is that people congratulate you but actually feel a tremendous amount of jealousy, which in return starts sending negative frequency your way. And the result is a failed venture. Doesn't happen all of the time, but on the embryo stage of your venture, keep it to yourself. No need to share anything with anyone. Stop looking for others' approval to move on with your life. Eliminate the them esteem and focus on yourself. Get the positive feedback from within you and not from the outside world who couldn't care less if you fail and bring you more negativity if you succeed. Many naysayers will always come to you and try discouraging you with your project because they are afraid of potential because they have none. They are afraid of you climbing the ladder of success because they can't do it on their own. People fear others when they're succeeding and wishes for the worst to happen. The lesson is to not share anything with anyone until your face is plastered on the Fortune 500 magazine. At this point, you wouldn't need to share anything because everyone will already know who you are. Now, to learn more about the universe, be sure to catch my show, The Happyness Journey, right here on MCM. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm here with Jordan Cooper. Now, we're discussing about his public interest podcast and his interest to run his campaign in 2018. Jordan, welcome back.
Thanks, Dan.
So tell me more about you were talking about Europe. You interviewed a few political campaigns there, or what was your journey there?
I had a wonderful opportunity this past summer to go to Europe, visit 6 different countries, and over the course of that trip, I was able to interview a few politicians in Europe. I interviewed a Greek cabinet secretary who had at one point been a political prisoner and was incarcerated by a dictator in the 60s in Greece.
Wow.
I had the opportunity to interview a Bundestag member, which is the national parliament of Germany, and 2 Landtag members, which is the state parliament of Germany. In a central state, analogous to Maryland, is called Thuringia. Okay. I think in English, American, it would be Thuringia.
Okay.
And so I was also able to interview a more right-wing politician in the Danish parliament in Copenhagen, and she represents a suburb outside of there, which I thought was quite interesting given the Brexit movement, the populist movement, and the rise of the far right in Europe and around the world. It was an amazing opportunity to have an opportunity to speak to all those different individuals.
Wow, and what did you learn from them compared to what we see in our political system?
So one thing I was quite surprised by, I actually have a personal I guess, hobby, which is I've traveled around the world, and in the United States and around the world, I enjoy seeing different parliaments. So I've seen about 30 state capitals in the United States and maybe about 20 national parliaments in other nations around the world. And I enjoy learning about their different styles of government. So you can really look at me and see a civic activist and somewhat of an obscure interest that I know everyone has. But for me, going to Germany and Greece, I was interested to learn that, of course, in America, we have the 3 branches of government: the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branches of government. But in Greece and in Germany, there's more of a blurring of the lines between the executive and the legislative branches of government. I hadn't known, for instance, that in central Germany, in the state parliament, you actually can run. So what happens? Their cabinet secretaries are often parliamentarians, and there's so many different things. One thing we spoke a lot earlier in the previous episode about raising money to run for elected office in America. And the average congressional seat costs $1.5 to $2 million. I'm busy fundraising every single day for my campaign. Money plays a big role in American politics. I was quite surprised to learn that my German counterparts had never raised $1 in their life.
Wow.
Yeah, so there are many different ways to operate a government and many different ways to advance the public interest. And I think that through Public Interest Podcasts, I hope to help listeners gain exposure to many different ways to broaden their perspective about how they can all the many different ideas that there are for how we can self-govern through a democratic process, and that there isn't any monopoly on truth or on what is correct, only different ways of going about it.
Interesting. Now, as I got in contact with you through a friend that actually interviewed here, she came to one of my seminars, how do you find your interviewers?
So I've been active in politics in Maryland for a decade and a half. So through my personal network, I know many different individuals. And also, I've been able to gain a reputation as somebody who's run for office, somebody who's dedicated to public service, who's volunteered a lot. And so that's kind of how I started my core group of interviewees. Now I'm up to 250. Many of these individuals I'd never met before. Okay. So what I do is I say, well, I've already interviewed these other individuals. It gives me some credibility. Here's my site. You can listen to the show. And people seem to have had a positive response to my mission, which is somewhat selfless. Of course, I don't believe in selfless altruism. I always believe that there's some element of ego and selfishness. I get great joy out of this. As I said, there may be a positive association due to my electability, or related to my electability due to the podcast. There's always something that you gain in doing public service, as I think you're gaining by doing this show, but you have the book here. So I think people recognize, I guess, sincere intentions in wanting to make the world better, and the importance of reviewing our humanity and in connecting through dialogue with difference. And so in that respect, I think people thought that they wouldn't mind sharing their stories with me for 25 minutes or so. It was a small ask, and based on that credibility, people have been willing to join me.
As we were talking before the break, we were discussing about the time invested into doing those podcasts. Now, how do you manage all this time? I mean, obviously that makes you happy, but at the same time, it's stressful. So the editing part, the interviewing, the time to call the interviewees, how do you do all that?
And I can't hire people to do these things for me. So I had to learn some HTML code. I had to build my own website. I had to learn sound editing in GarageBand. I had to learn how to buy which microphone and how to operate it and connect it and record it and then do post-production editing and then get it live and then do videos, and I do 360-degree image capture. Yeah, it's a learning process. I think there's no better way to learn than by doing. I'm certainly enjoying it. I think I'm producing a high enough quality product that I've been able to get 65,000 listens in the last 11 months to my podcast. And you keep learning and doing, and sometimes I can do 6 episodes in a day, and sometimes I'll do 1 or none, and then it's just a matter of having the willpower to push through. So, and balancing everything. Of course, I have a personal life, and you got to make sure that you have time for yourself. So, yeah, it's not always the easiest thing, but for me, it's something that's worth pursuing.
So, as the show, it's based on happiness. What is your definition of happiness going through this political career, the ups and downs that you're dealing with? What ultimately will make you happy, Jordan?
To me, happiness is an element of fulfillment. I think for me, perhaps one of the most important things to do in life is seek that you have a fulfilling life. So I think that happy for me has some sort of connotation of a more ephemeral feeling that is more of the moment. So I think that maybe having a nice car or having lots of money may bring more brief happiness. But for me, fulfillment seems to have a more long-lasting implication over life, a sense of purpose and being fulfilled. And sometimes you're not happy. I mean, it's not the best thing in the world to spend 12 hours in a row just uploading past episodes and preparing them and editing them. But for me, fulfillment comes feeling as though I'm creating something that's mine, my own enterprise, an opportunity to advance the public interest as I see fit. When I see something wrong with this country, I'm not the biggest fan of the individual who occupies the White House right now. I'm not the biggest fan of America's trend towards two separate Americas. It's a hyper-partisan and increasingly partisan, there's an increasing amount of partisan polarity in this nation. Increasingly, I see two separate Americas emerging, where there's one on the right and one on the left. And I see those as I don't see that as necessarily in the public interest. And I see that there's increasing intolerance of difference, whether I'm marching with other Democrats who have no interest in learning about what Republicans think, or whether I'm hearing the president speak about so disparagingly about pretty much anyone in his party or elsewhere. I think that having an opportunity to take direct action to implement a solution, which is, I'm making my country better as best as I can. I'm taking all that Jordan Cooper is and all that I have and all the resources have been poured into me, and I'm doing the best I can with who I am and what resources I have to leave the world better than I found it. And ultimately, I think there's not very much more that you can ask of yourself. For me, that's fulfilling. It's more than just living for myself and having fun with friends, which of course I still do and enjoy, but being part of a larger enterprise, and that's towards a noble, higher calling. And I think that is often how I'm able to find my fulfillment.
Would you say the public interest podcast is your hobby versus something that you just want to eventually grow to a point where you could focus primarily on it?
I would love to be able to focus primarily on it. Of course, you need to build certain audiences in order to make it financially sustainable. So I'd love to get there at some point. Who knows? CNN started in a small room in Virginia with a little CNN written out of wood on the back wall. So you never know where things might evolve to. It may die, it may grow, it may be perpetuated in the status quo.
Interesting. Now, eventually, when you look at public interest podcasts, would you make it more as try to syndicate it, or is it going to be mostly local?
So it currently is somewhat syndicated on a platform called Blog Talk Radio, and that inserts advertisements at the beginning and end of every episode. I like it to be local, but I also like to expand it. So I focus very much where I am now. So that's a lot of Montgomery County and Maryland politicians, nonprofit executives, because that's who I have access to, and I began with my network. But as you've seen, I've grown to Europe. I've grown with ambassadors in Washington. I've spoken to media personalities over the phone in New York, like Tom Keene with Bloomberg News. I've never even met him. So I think growing sustainably over time and building on what I've already created is something that I'd like to move towards.
Now, if you combine your political career and the public interest podcast and your career doing everything that I mentioned in the beginning, what are your hobbies?
Yeah. So I used to be a tennis player.
Okay.
And I always speak about something, throwing yourself towards something larger than yourself. For 7 years, I worked very hard with the ambition of becoming a professional tennis player. I ultimately stopped at being a professional tennis instructor, a teaching pro, over at Congressional Country Club. And I played varsity in college a little bit in the lower bench. For me, it's always, so sports are important to me. Racquetball, tennis, health, taking care of your body. I have a family dog. I take him swimming in the Potomac River from time to time. I travel. I like to do adventures, sailing, skydiving, things like that. So, always up for a new adventure and traveling around. I actually just spent a week in Mississippi with a friend of mine. I really was interested in seeing what this other America is, this redder, more conservative America, and it was a good time to have a different perspective. So for me, I think traveling and always learning and being exposed to the arts and cultures is the way I use my free time.
Wow, and I guess your free time is very, very limited. Come to think of everything that you do. I mean, I read about what you've done and your career, etc. It seems like it's draining.
Yeah. Well, it's also invigorating. You have to think about what your personality type is. For me, I love being around other people. I'm energized by what is exhausting and draining for others. I'm an extrovert who I get more energy by being around others and moving from thing to thing. I like to have 12 things on my calendar every single day, and for me, that's the way I like to live my life. And I think that leading a fulfilling life, a happy life, is one in which you have had a moment to be introspective, to evaluate who you are, and then have been able to design your life in accordance with your values, your personality, and what sort of life you want to live. Taking active ownership and owning, having agency in your own life, I think is perhaps my perspective on how one ought to best pursue their path to happiness and fulfillment in life.
Wow, thank you so much, Jordan. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Now, I want to thank our guest again for a second time at our TV studio. Thank you so much for coming and inspiring again our viewers by sharing your very interesting, challenging career in politics. And I'm very excited about season 2 of the Happiness Journey, full of inspirational stories just like the one you heard today. Now, here are a few concluding words of wisdom. Now, most don't realize it, and few stops and wonder. Yet, from the extremely limited perspective afforded by your physical senses, it is impossible to know what you really, really want in material or circumstantial terms, because there's always more that you could be asking for than you could even see. Now, more insight, more rewards, and more fun. Now, of course, you have an idea, and by all means, you should pursue your material and circumstantial dreams. But as you knock on doors and turn over stones, perpetually think to yourself, this or better. Oh yeah. My name is Dr. Dan, and have yourself a wonderful day.